There is a specific feeling you get when you do something that contradicts everything you thought you stood for, and you cannot explain why it bothered you as much as it did. Not guilt exactly, something closer to being caught. As if someone were watching, someone whose opinion you had never consciously decided to care about, and you had just failed their test. Most people dismiss this feeling quickly. They call it conscience or they call it anxiety, and they move on. But the speed with which you dismiss it is itself a symptom, because that tribunal, the one you never assembled, never agreed to, never even looked at directly, has been sitting in session your entire adult life, judging everything you do, and you have been presenting evidence to it every day without knowing you were on trial. This is not about your parents. Not exactly. What you carry is something more entrenched than memory and more durable than resentment. It is a set of criteria for what a good life looks like, what a worthwhile person does, what success means, what failure means, what ambition is allowed to look like, that were loaded into you before you were old enough to object to them. And then you were handed the keys and told you were free. The mechanism has a name. Erich Fromm called it the anonymous authority, the internalized consensus of a social order that no longer speaks to you directly because it doesn't need to. It already lives inside you. You enforce it yourself, and you mistake the enforcement for preference. What most people spend their lives doing, without knowing it, is pursuing the approval of a tribunal whose members they have never examined, in a game whose rules they were handed before they could read them, and calling this autonomy. The promise of what follows is not that you will be liberated from this. Liberation is not the accurate word, and anything that promises it is selling you something cheaper than the actual problem deserves. The promise is more specific and more uncomfortable that you will be able to see it clearly enough that it can no longer run you entirely in the dark, because the mechanism only has purchase when it is invisible. If this channel is where you want to think about things that are harder to name than most content is willing to go, subscribe. The work here is not about making the uncomfortable comfortable. It is about making it visible enough to work with. One more subscriber means one more person in this conversation. Fromm, writing in 1941, in a book that most people have heard of and fewer have read, made an argument that is still more radical than most modern psychology has caught up to. He was trying to explain why people who had been given unprecedented freedom, historical, political, personal, were choosing to abandon it. Why they were fleeing into authority, into conformism, into ideological certainty, into the surrender of precisely the thing they had been promised. His answer was not that freedom is dangerous in the abstract. It was something more specific. When you are released from external authority, from the traditions, hierarchies, and social structures that used to tell you who to be, you do not automatically become yourself. You become anxious, because the self that was supposed to emerge when the authority released its grip turns out to be underdeveloped. It was never allowed to form. And the anxiety of that emptiness is so severe that most people immediately fill it, not with their own values, which take time and conflict to develop, but with the values of whoever is closest, loudest, or most certain. You do not escape the authority. You just internalize it so completely that it begins to feel like your own voice. This is the mechanism, and the reason it is so difficult to detect is that it does not feel like imposition. It feels like conviction. The distinction matters enormously because what feels like conviction tends to be treated as a terminal point. You stop examining conviction. You examine doubt. You examine ambivalence. But when something feels certain, when it feels like you are simply seeing clearly what is right or wrong, what matters or does not, the examination stops. And the anonymous authority is sophisticated enough to dress itself in exactly the texture of certainty. This is its primary advantage. Not that it commands you, that it convinces you you are not being commanded at all. Here is the behavior you have probably never had named this way before. You do something, make a choice, spend money on something you actually want, decline an obligation, take a path that was not the expected one. And afterward you feel a faint but persistent sense that you have done something wrong. Not that it was wrong in any way you could defend to someone else. Not that any harm was caused. Just that feeling of wrongness, as if you had violated a rule, as if some standard had been failed. And then, and this is the specific thing to notice, you find yourself composing a defense, in your head, to no one, explaining why your choice was acceptable, citing reasons, making the case. Who are you talking to? You have been presenting your life to a court that you did not appoint, defending decisions to a judge you would not choose. The defense you construct is real, which means the prosecution is real, which means the authority issuing the verdict is real, even if it is entirely internal, even if it belongs to no living person, even if the person whose approval you are constructing these arguments for has been dead for years, or has changed, or would not recognize the standards you have attributed to them. This is what Fromm meant when he said the anonymous authority is more tyrannical than overt authority, not less. When someone tells you directly what to do, you can disagree with them, you can argue or leave or decide they are wrong. But when the authority is inside you, when the voice that evaluates your choices is the very voice you use to think, there is no one to argue with. The prosecution and the jury are the same entity, and it has the further advantage of feeling like your conscience. There is a particular kind of person this applies to with unusual force. Not the person who is obviously still trying to please their parents, whose compliance is visible and acknowledged. That person at least knows the authority is external, even if they cannot quite leave it. The person this mechanism runs hardest is the one who has already made the break, who has done the visible work of departure and now believes the authority is gone because the break was real. The disagreement was real. The distance was real. But the evaluative framework underneath the break, the standard by which you decided that the break was necessary, the criteria by which you measured it as courageous or correct, that framework did not leave with you. You used their criteria to conclude that their criteria were wrong. And the tribunal is still sitting. Nietzsche's contribution to this problem was not psychological. It was genealogical. His question was not what values feel like from the inside. Fromm handled that. But where they actually come from. The origin of moral conviction, not its texture. The answer he arrived at was that values are not discovered. They are not found through reason or intuited through some faculty that has reliable access to moral truth. They are made, constructed, historically, by specific groups of people with specific interests and specific positions in a social order. And once made, they are transmitted through religion, through culture, through education, through family, through every structure that touches a person before they are old enough to interrogate it. What gets transmitted is not the origin. What gets transmitted is the conclusion. You receive the "this is right" and the "this is wrong" stripped of the history that produced them, stripped of the interests that were served by the producing, stripped of the contingency that would make them recognizable as positions rather than facts. Nietzsche called this the herd, not as an insult, but as a description of the mechanism. The herd does not coerce you with a threat. It does something far more effective. It shapes the very lens through which you evaluate what deserves to be wanted, so that by the time you're old enough to ask what you want, the wanting has already been pre-configured. The wanting feels like yours. It has your voice. It arrives in the first person, and it was authored somewhere else entirely. But here is what most readings of Nietzsche stop before they reach. The problem is not simply that your values were given to you by others. The problem is that the very faculty you would use to examine them, to decide which ones are genuinely yours and which were imposed, was also shaped by what was given. You are trying to audit the instrument with the instrument. There is no external calibration point. The person doing the genealogical work on their own values is doing that work with a mind whose evaluative structures are themselves products of the genealogy being examined. This does not mean the examination is worthless. It means that anyone who emerges from the examination feeling certain they have now separated the authentic from the installed, that they have finished the work, has made a specific error. They have confused the feeling of insight with the completion of a project that does not complete. The herd's deepest reach is not into what you value. It is into the confidence with which you believe you have stopped being subject to it. Think for a moment about the specific shape of your independence, not in the abstract, in the concrete, the choices you would describe, if pressed, as most fully yours, the things you have decided against the grain of what was expected, against the pressure of what was comfortable, against the path of least resistance. Now ask a different question. Who would you most want to know about those choices? Not who you would want to approve of them, whose awareness of them would feel most like confirmation, most like the evidence being received by the right court. Because there is almost certainly a specific face in that answer, or a specific category of person, or a specific community whose recognition you are, without quite noticing it, still working toward. And that recognition, the thing you are working toward, without acknowledging you are working toward it, is the shape of the authority that is still running you. The person who left the religion is often, quietly, working toward the recognition of the secular intellectual they always wanted to impress. The person who left the corporate path is working toward the recognition of the creative community they believe represents something freer. Every departure carries inside it the shadow of the tribunal whose approval the departure was designed to earn. This is not cynicism about human motivation. It is a more specific observation that we do not escape evaluation by changing what we are being evaluated on. We relocate the evaluator, and the relocation feels like freedom, because the new authority is the one we chose, except that the choosing was done by a self already shaped by the previous one. There is a moment in human development, roughly the first decade of life, though the edges are soft, when the brain is doing something remarkable and irreversible. It is not just learning facts about the world. It is building the scaffolding that will determine, for the rest of life, what kinds of things are worth wanting, what kinds of people are worth becoming, what success and failure and dignity and shame actually mean. During this window, children do not have the cognitive architecture to evaluate what they are receiving. They cannot examine a value and decide whether to accept it. They can only absorb, which means that the values delivered in this period arrive without the possibility of consent. They are not opinions that can be updated on reflection. They are structures that shape how reflection itself works. By the time you're old enough to disagree with your parents, the parts of you that do the disagreeing have already been shaped by them. Jung understood this differently, but reached a related conclusion. He was interested in the persona, the face the psyche constructs to navigate social expectation. The persona forms in early life out of the genuine necessity to secure belonging. And it is not deception, it is adaptation. It works. But the problem Jung identified is that over time, if the persona is not examined, it begins to feel like the self. The mask and the face fuse, and then when you act against the persona, when you do something that violates the values it was built to project, you do not experience it as freedom, you experience it as wrongness, as the specific register of moral failure. What you call your conscience is often your persona, policing you back into compliance. And the cruelty of this is that the persona's policing mechanism feels morally weighted. It does not feel like a social rule being enforced. It feels like truth, like you have done something genuinely wrong rather than something merely unexpected by the structure you inherited. Which means that following your actual values, the ones that begin to emerge when the persona is examined, is accompanied by a persistent and disorienting feeling of transgression, even when no transgression has occurred. The people who are most thoroughly captured by this dynamic are the ones who most identify with being morally serious, because the persona, for them, is built around exactly that identity, and anything that departs from its standards will arrive in their inner life with the full weight of moral accusation. Frankl wrote that between every stimulus and every response, there is a space, and in that space lies the freedom to choose who we become. This has been quoted so many times in so many motivational contexts that the radical core of the idea has been nearly completely extracted from it. So it is worth going back to what Frankl actually observed, not as encouragement, but as a clinical and philosophical description of a specific human capacity. He did not mean that in every moment you have the ability to freely choose your response. He did not mean that conditioning can be overridden simply by deciding to, or that your circumstances are irrelevant to what you are able to do. He meant something much more limited and much more demanding, that there exists, however briefly, a flicker of awareness between the stimulus and the response. A moment in which you could, in principle, notice that a response is forming. Most people never access this space consciously at all. The conditioning fills it so fast and so completely that the response is underway before any noticing has occurred. The stimulus arrives. The value structure activates. The evaluation happens. The verdict is issued. And all of it feels seamless. Feels like perception rather than process, because the mechanism is invisible. What the anonymous authority does is colonize this space. It occupies the interval between what happens and how you respond with a verdict that feels like your own judgment. You do not think, my inherited evaluative framework is processing this situation and generating a conclusion I am about to experience as my own perception. You simply think, this is right, or this is shameful, or I would not be the kind of person who does that. But here is the thing Frankl pointed at that most users of his idea overlook. The space can become a residence. You can learn to stay in it, not to use it as a brief moment of deliberation before responding, but to inhabit the not yet decided as a sustained condition, to hold the gap between stimulus and verdict open long enough to ask whose verdict this is. The difficulty is that staying in the space feels like a failure to resolve. The anonymous authority treats irresolution as weakness, as moral hesitation, as the absence of the clarity that a certain person would have. The pressure to close the gap, to produce the verdict, to land on the side of the evaluation that was prepared in advance. That pressure, it is not neutral. It is the authority insisting on itself. Learning to resist it is not the same as learning to respond differently. It is learning to notice, first, that a response was being generated by something other than your considered judgment, and that noticing, without immediately resolving it, is itself an act of psychological defection. Marcus Aurelius, writing not as a philosopher, but as someone who had to govern an empire under conditions that would have collapsed most people, returned again and again to a question that his position made unusually sharp. Which of the things I am carrying right now did I actually pick up, and which were placed on me? The Stoic framing of this is usually rendered as the dichotomy of control. What is yours and what is not? But that rendering has been domesticated so thoroughly by modern usage that its force is almost entirely gone. It has become a stress management technique, a way of releasing anxiety about outcomes you cannot change. That is not what Marcus was doing. What he was doing was something more radical, trying to identify in real time which of his felt obligations were genuinely his and which were the expectations of a role, a lineage, an empire, a historical moment performing through him. Not so he could abandon them. He was, to the end, conscientious about his duties, but so he could carry them with a clarity about who was carrying them and why. This distinction between carrying something because it is yours and carrying it because it was put there before you knew you had the option to object is the work. Not a project that concludes, not a process that terminates in authenticity and rest. A continuous practice of noticing the difference between weight you chose and weight you are still carrying, because no one ever told you that you were allowed to set it down. The ordinary life does not support this practice. The relationships that matter to you carry the memory of the standards you were raised with. The institutions you operate inside have their own evaluative frameworks that press on you daily. The social fabric itself is composed of interlocking consensuses that have an enormous interest in your continued compliance. There is no withdrawal to a position outside the system from which you can finally see it clearly, because the seeing happens from inside what you are trying to see. This is the last and most stubborn difficulty. The examined life requires an examiner, and the examiner was formed by what is being examined, which means the project is not one of eventual arrival, but of perpetual revision, of holding your own conclusions provisionally, of treating certainty as a signal rather than a destination, of staying inside the difficulty instead of resolving it into a more comfortable story about who you have now become. Fromm had a word for what he believed could emerge from this kind of practice. Not authenticity, which he distrusted. The word invites too much confidence about what the authentic self actually is. His word was spontaneous. He meant it technically, action that arises from the actual conditions of who you are, as opposed to action produced by the mechanism running in your place. Spontaneous not in the sense of impulsive, but in the sense of originating from within rather than arriving from without, and being mistaken for within. The distinction is real but difficult to feel from the inside, which is part of what makes this work hard, because both feel like acting from yourself. The anonymous authority, when it is running you, does not feel like an external imposition. It feels like your own perspective. The spontaneous response, when it actually comes from you, does not always feel freer or more certain or more morally clean. It often feels tentative, provisional. Not quite like the decisive clarity that the authority produces on demand. This is counterintuitive enough to be worth sitting with. The authority feels more like you than you do. Its verdicts are immediate and confident. Your actual values, where they have survived the examination, tend to arrive more quietly and with more uncertainty and without the sense of standing on bedrock. Which is exactly why people keep returning to the authority. The certainty it offers feels like integrity. The uncertainty of the genuine feels like weakness. But certainty here is not the signal of truth. It is the signal of a mechanism working exactly as designed. What then does the actual work look like? Not liberation. Not the replacement of installed values with authentic ones, as if there were a clean inventory to be taken and a clear line between what is yours and what is not. Not a crisis of identity followed by reconstruction. Not a break. The work looks like noticing. Specifically and repeatedly noticing the moment when a verdict arrives. Not the verdict itself. You often cannot stop the verdict from arriving, and trying to prevent it is its own kind of distortion, but noticing that it arrived. Noticing its specific texture, the way it feels like clarity rather than conclusion, the way it speaks in your own voice without having been asked, the way it is already certain before you have finished examining what happened, and then, before you act from it, as if it were simply true, pausing long enough to ask, when did I decide this? Not as an accusation, as a genuine question. When did I decide that this particular thing, this standard, this expectation, this measure of what a worthwhile person does or does not do, was the correct measure? Did I decide it? Or did it arrive? And did I simply not object? Because I was not yet old enough to understand what was being installed. The question does not always produce an answer. The genealogy of a specific value is often impossible to reconstruct. But the asking does something to the certainty. It loosens the automatic quality of the verdict. It introduces, briefly, the possibility that the authority speaking in your voice might not be you. This is different from cynicism, which dismisses inherited values simply because they were inherited. The work is more demanding and more uncomfortable than cynicism. It requires holding each value individually, not dismissing the inheritance wholesale, which is its own flight from the difficulty, and asking specifically whether this one, in the situation, reflects something you have actually examined and affirm, or whether it is running on momentum, carrying itself forward because it has always been there, because it has the texture of bedrock, because questioning it feels, precisely because the authority designed it to feel this way, like moral failure. The person who sweeps all inherited values out in a single gesture of self-declared authenticity has not escaped the mechanism. They have performed their escape to the same tribunal, the sweep itself, the totality, the confidence. The clean narrative of before and after carries the fingerprints of an authority that needed the departure to be legible, to be admirable, to be the kind of break that earns recognition from the right kind of people. The authority shifts its criteria and the person follows and calls the following liberation. Real examination is slower and less satisfying than that. It is piecemeal. It does not produce a clean story. It produces a provisional inventory that requires constant updating, in which some inherited values survive the examination and others do not, and the line between them is never as clear as you would like it to be, and the work never arrives at a point where it is finished. You will know this has become real work rather than an interesting idea when you find yourself in the middle of an ordinary situation, a decision about work or time, or what to decline or what to actually want, and you notice the tribunal convene. The verdict arrives before you have quite finished thinking. The feeling of wrongness or rightness, of permission or prohibition, confident and immediate. And for one moment, before you respond to it as if it were simply the truth, you see it for what it is. Not a fact about the world, not your conscience, not the truth of who you are and what you should do. A verdict from a court you did not assemble, applying criteria you did not choose, in a case you never agreed to have tried. You will still have to decide what to do with the verdict. That part does not get easier. The authority will keep issuing its conclusions, and the conclusions will keep feeling like yours, and the work of noticing will keep being required. It does not end with a transformation. It does not deliver you to a self that finally feels settled. What it delivers is something more modest and more real. The capacity to stand occasionally in the gap between the verdict and your response, and know that you are standing there, not free from the authoritative. That promise was never on offer, but no longer entirely subject to it in the dark. The authority has always been there. You have always been obeying it. The only thing that changes now is that you know. If that recognition is uncomfortable, leave a comment that says, "I've been living someone else's verdict."